Hi, everyone. This is Ben Prochazka. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really glad that you joined us as a starting point. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2026. This is our first webinar in the new year, and we look forward to doing these throughout the year. We started last year with the first one with Stephanie to bring in some of the expertise of one of our great Electrification Coalition Business Council members, Cox, who does quarterly industry insights, and so this is the next installment. So every quarter we'll do this where we basically bring Stephanie to have a conversation and talk a little bit about what are the market trends, what are we seeing with electrification happening across the country, if there's anything that sort of stands out from markets that are particularly active. So are there states that are demonstrating particular success? Obviously also maybe if there are challenges in the marketplace, what do those look like? And we'll also talk about them relative to the rest of the globe. Maybe as a starting point though, it would be foolish of me not to talk about the fact that the EV market has been pretty challenging in quarter four since the end of the tax credit and a number of the other policies, not to mention prior to the elections, just the politics that got sort of injected into transportation electrification, in some ways not in the most helpful way in the US. And it's led to, a pretty interesting market, I would say. And when I bring Stephanie in a minute, I would just share that, we are seeing some downturns in the market. There's no denying that. I'm not sure they're as bad or as problematic as maybe some of the headlines might be saying. I feel like every headline I read right now is the EV market has fallen off a cliff. And I would say we're maybe more in a bump in the road, although it doesn't mean there aren't challenges and there aren't things that we need to work on. From the EC's perspective, we're continually committed to this. It's a matter of economic and national security. It's about the impacts of oil dependency and the idea that transportation electrification provides us the greatest chance to diversify the way that we power the future of transportation. And it removes us from the big challenges that exist around a global oil market that oftentimes is out of our control and impacted or influenced by countries that maybe don't share our democratic values. But I might argue that it's also starting to be more and more influenced by globally the idea that the US is really hanging on to the internal combustion engine while the rest of the world is going electric. And that potentially puts us in this very challenging question of what is the future of the US automotive sector, and is it going to survive as we see the rest of the world going electric and as maybe we're not moving as quickly as everyone else. Our work this year, we're focused a lot on how do we engage at the local and state level. There are huge opportunities to do that. So we're working across the country. We're working to transition fleets because those represent pretty significant sectors that is still seeing all the benefits of transportation electrification. We're also focused on things like the utility sector, where there's really good opportunities to work with utilities across the country to make significant investments in transportation electrification and build out the infrastructure that we need. So without further ado, I would like to invite Stephanie to join us. So welcome, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy New Year. Thank you so much. I look forward to our conversations around everything EV.
Happy New Year to you as well. And I actually can't believe we're in 2026, to be honest. It just feels very odd that we've already met that stage. So maybe Stephanie is the director of industry insights for Cox Automotive, and we are lucky to have her as a partner, as I mentioned, on the Electrification Coalition Business Council. Before we talk about what's the latest and greatest on the analysis, I did want to remind folks or tell people that we do have a Q&A in the chat, and sorry, not in the chat, but as part of this. And so if you look up at the top of the screen, you should see where it says Q&A. And if you have questions as we're going through things, please put your questions in there, and we will try to include those in our dialogue and or at the very end when we maybe take some specific time to focus on the Q&A. But maybe as a starting point, Stephanie, Cox is this company that maybe people don't know as well as they should in the automotive sector. And so can you maybe help people, give them a little bit more background on what Cox does and what is Cox Automotive engaged in and some of the companies that you all own or manage?
Yeah, sure. So we're Cox Automotive, as Ben mentioned. We're a technology service provider for the automotive. We pretty much touch every part of the automotive ecosystem, except we don't build the vehicles. You might be familiar with some of our companies, KBB, Kelly Blue Book, Auto Trader. We also own wholesale auctions called Manheim. And that's where we get a really good sense of what's going on in the used market. And so we have those throughout the country. We also have a dealership titling. We build websites. So we do a lot of stuff. We even have software that when you take your car for servicing, that tracks car servicing and registration and that type of thing. So a lot of aspects of our company touch a lot of different touch points in the automotive sector.
Amazing. Yeah, no, it's pretty wild to think about how much you all are engaged in the broader automotive sector. And when we started working with you, I hadn't realized that you are part of Kelly Blue Book, which is something I've used. I couldn't even begin to tell you how many times in my life to both understand when I was buying used cars, what's their value, but also, when we're selling them, what should they be looking like? So, okay, so every quarter, Cox Automotive, in partnership with some others, basically does a quarterly sales analysis and a market report that highlights what are some of the trends that we're seeing. And so, I guess maybe as a big picture general, and obviously we're focused on electrification here, but electrification matters within the context of the entire market. Are there any highlights that you would want to mention or share as an opening?
I think I'll just share kind of looking at 2025 and then going into 2026. Definitely, there's a lot of headwinds. We had changes in policy. We had tariffs. We had the IRA go away. We had, the new administration. We had CAFE standards become less stringent. So a lot of policy changes that created a lot of volatility in the market. So when you're trying to forecast whether it was new vehicles, new EVs, a lot of different things to take into consideration. So I think we're going to continue to go into 2026, hopefully with a little more stability in terms of policy changes. But definitely, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace from a consumer perspective, and also affordability. That continues to be one of the main drivers for consumers either opting not to buy a new car or maybe focusing on a used vehicle. And that's even more challenging for EVs, which have a higher ATP, average transaction price, premium over gas vehicles. So those are some of the challenges. But I think as we end 2025, we had an amazing Q3. As we all knew, the IRA was going away. So we had a lot of pull ahead sales. And we had a record quarter, which we got to about 10.4% market share. Going into Q4, the numbers are finally we don't have final numbers, but it looks like we're going to have a decline, a significant decline. We're probably going to get to around 233,000 units, and that's about a 37% decline year over year. But we'll end the year at about probably 1.5–2% decline. And so I think that Q3 really helped pull the numbers up. So that's kind of where we're ending the year. Definitely going to 2026. I think just the overall market, Ben, as you mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think affordability still exists. So I think it's challenging for the overall market, not just the EV part of it.
It's sort of one of those things I could pull out so many things about what you just went through. For those playing along at home, though, CAFE is the corporate average fuel economy, and so it's one of the things that established that the corporate average fleet had to hit a certain number over a certain period of time, and basically that's one of the policies, unfortunately, that has been unwound during the current administration. And I think part of why that's a problem is that it creates market ambiguity, right? Like it made it very straightforward for automakers and policymakers to understand that we have to really be aggressive on our policy choices and focus on electrification, amongst other things. And so doing away with things like CAFE and or also the tax credits, are kind of like a double whammy in addition to then the tariffs and lots of other things. And so in some ways, it's not that surprising. Now, you did mention a couple things. So the drop down from Q3 to Q4 was pretty dramatic. And then Q4 year over year, meaning from 24 to 25, saw a big drop. But some of that to me just seems like it is really that demand being pulled forward. Everyone knew the tax credit was coming to an end. And so, a lot of buyers went to the market early on. But is there anything that you think shows up in what that future looks like, or are you forecasting and how you're thinking about what the future looks like, and what 26 may sort of look like for us?
Yeah, I think 26 will probably be around, flat, could go a little up, a little bit down. But I think if you look at 2026, there's about 20 plus models being launched. So and there's some affordable ones. If you think about the Bolt, the new Leaf just came out. There's Toyota and Subaru are launching some at the end of the year. Slate's going to have a product at the end of the year. So I think we're going to start to see some affordable EV models. Meantime, we're going to continue to see innovation on battery technology, innovation and efficiencies in manufacturing. So I think all that's positive. But I think the industry, we really need affordable models. 61% of all the EV models are over 65,000 K. That pushes out a lot of the consumer. And if we want mainstream adoption, we need to have more compelling, affordable models. And I think we'll get there. We're starting to see manufacturers pivot that way. So I think that's what's going to happen in 2026. The other thing that we're seeing is hybrids. We've seen manufacturers starting to put more of those hybrids into their product portfolio. And for a consumer, that's an easy sell. It's good fuel efficiency. There's a lot of options. The price point is pretty close to parity with ICE in some cases. And you get some of those environmental benefits if that's something that is important to you.
Yeah, and we, as an organization, we really focus on the idea of it needs to plug in, because it does take the most significant step forward around how do you get off oil.
Right.
But I think it is helpful that there's more exposure and sort of normalization of electrification. And I think that batteries on a vehicle, the more that people sort of see that, the better that's going to be overall. Now, you mentioned the sort of what's happened in the market, and we focused in on EVs, but what's the overall market say? Like I think overall vehicle prices have gone up, so it's not just an EV problem. I
Yes.
also, in looking at your data, it looked like most car buyers are actually on the wealthier side, period, regardless of what type of propulsion system. But is there anything else on the ICE to EV market analysis that shows up?
Yeah, I think if we go back to the pandemic, right, that during that time, like a lot of industries, it increased the average transaction price. And since then, it's that kind of our baseline. And so we've started already higher that from the 2021 to 2022 timeframe that really took it up. So I think that's really impacted the average transaction price of a vehicle, which is close to 50,000, right? And so that's very expensive. And I think the other thing is that, to your point about the market, we keep hearing about this K economy. So we're being very bifurcated where this wealthy demographic that's really pushing new car sales, and that demographic is buying expensive SUVs, trucks. So that also pushes up the average transaction price as well. And I think as we think about the lower income quintile, it's either causing that demographic to hold out on buying a new vehicle or look into the used market. So I think that's another, I think, especially EVs, if you look at used EV, that's going to be, I think, a bright point in the marketplace, used EV, because there's going to be a lot of options as we start to see more and more EVs come off lease and at really good affordable price points.
Yeah, and so let's talk total volume for a second, because oftentimes we talk about market percentage, but that can be a distorted fact because there's a lot of factors that influence market percentage. And so what do total volumes look like in 2025 ICE to EV, and maybe in comparison to 24?
Yeah, so 2025, we're about at 16.3 million. That was up about 2% from 2024. And it's interesting, like and once again, it's all about, you thought about the tariffs that were, announced, that pushed pull ahead sales. And then you had the IRA, more sales. And so that's why the marketplace, we weren't sure it was going to end up at 16.3. We had originally thought it was going to be lower, but a lot of pull ahead sales. But going into the third quarter, it's starting to slow down, and we'll probably continue to see that going into 2026, which we're estimating a decrease in overall volume closer to 15.9 maybe.
And then on the EV side, what's and you mentioned a decline, right? Like an overall market decline, but it's not as, it's a drop, but it's like when you talk about volume, it's actually not that
It's not
significant.
that, like, if you look at 2024, 2025 is going to be, I think I have it right here. 2024 was like 1,295,000 units. 2025 is going to be about 1,275 units. So to your point, not a lot of units. So I think that's kind of just probably what we're going to see going into 2026 as well. However, we do have, as I mentioned, some of these new models launching, and that could really, if those resonate with consumers, we can see an uptick. And I also think we have a growing, reliable infrastructure, which is going to be critical to adoption.
Yeah, it's the idea that we've only dropped 20,000 units, 20,000 cars from 2024 to 2025. We lost the credit at the last quarter, and everybody's talking about this sort of like cratering of the market. And it's not. I'm not suggesting we aren't seeing a drop, but it maybe isn't as dramatic as sometimes the headlines show. And I do think that's a takeaway. I just want people to recognize it. It's like it's been caught up in the narrative.
Right.
And it's not where we thought we were going to be had we kept or retained all of the Inflation Reduction Act policies. But it is something where there's still lots of reasons why there's hope, and EVs aren't going away. And I think that's one of the things that I would show is that it is still something moving forward. I will bring. Hey, somebody put in the chat whether or not they should be seeing charts or graphs. No, is the quick answer. And so I do think, we are doing this as a dialogue. So if there's stuff that comes up, we're really just trying to talk about it today. But if somebody wanted to see where the Cox reports are, where do they find those in the future?
Yeah, it's on our website. I can put something in the chat.
Okay. And maybe
Before
that's
we
one of the
end.
things we'll just do at the end of this is we'll make sure it's in the chat so that if people are really looking for more detail, more minutia in the report, they can find it. And my sense is it's oftentimes you all do this where it's not just the EV report. You're the EV person, but then Cox is analyzing the entirety of the market.
The entire market.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Ben, I just want to reiterate what you said. Like, the future is electric. The timeline has shifted. And I think if you look at the economics, we're going to get to this point where we continue to see battery prices or battery innovation, right? So the price is going to continue to go down. Right now, it has been going down due to overcapacity and decline in some of those materials. But I think the innovation is going to continue. The lower total cost of ownership, I think that's going to be important too as well, right? And once we get that price down and more affordable options, and you can buy an EV at price parity. So that's a good, strong value proposition. And if you can charge at home, you have that ability, or there's accessibility to other charging that's not expensive.
Yeah.
That's reasonable. I think those are some of the challenges, but also I think the reasons why EVs are going to continue to grow.
Yeah, and I think we all work from a policy perspective on the idea of how do we accelerate EV adoption as quickly as possible. And sometimes that means we're doing some of the hardest things first. We should recognize like there are these sort of early stage adoption moments where those are success points and they do show up. And maybe as a connection, is there anything that we're seeing on the like states that are particularly high? So even though maybe we've seen a little bit of a decline at the end of Q4, but what's happening at the state level?
Yeah, I definitely think if you look at, California definitely is leading, right? But you have Colorado and some of those western states like Nevada and Oregon, Washington. I was in Colorado over the holiday break and saw EVs all over the place. And I also saw a lot of education, like information, like you might see a billboard, or you might see something at a dealership on a billboard. And so I think it goes to show that those states that have EV incentives available still, EV friendly, maybe they have a lot of educational engagement with consumers through the utility or through nonprofits. So definitely think we'll continue to see those states continue with more adoption going into 2026. But definitely I was looking at the data for a state, and this is retail, and this is through October 2025. But Michigan had the largest increase in percentage points of share. 2025, they're at 7.5. They were at 4.5 at 2024, year to date October. This is what the date goes to. And then Colorado, Nevada, Florida, and Louisiana even had a 1.7 increase year over year. So those are just a few data points to show that we're going to continue to see variation by state, and it has a lot to do with what incentives are available, maybe familiarity. I think about here in Georgia where I live, we have the Hyundai Meta plant. We're probably going to start to see over time a more increase in Hyundai Ioniqs, right?
Yeah.
Familiarity, I think that's going to help as well as you start to see people or know people that have one and have had a good experience. I think that helps.
I'm going to do a little bit of a pivot here, as you brought up Hyundai and one of the global automakers. But the story that we're telling is, a little bit of a drop and a challenging market in the U.S. And obviously, some of that is a function of the vast number of policies that we saw go away. But what are we seeing globally?
Yeah, globally, I'm sure everyone sees the headlines, China, OEMs, BYD. BYD now has surpassed Tesla as the number one EV automaker. Globally, we're going to get over 20 million EVs sold. So 1 in 4 is going to be what we're seeing. But the thing that's, I think, interesting with the Chinese OEMs, they've had a lot of overcapacity, and one of their strategy is to just export. And they've done that a lot. They're really seeing incredible market share growth in the UK, Germany, places like New Zealand, Australia, even Vietnam and Thailand have seen growth. And so I think the world globally, right, because of China pushing their product, it's a reasonable price, it's good quality. I think that's really changing the landscape. And so I think that's another reason I think for the US will stay, we're EV, they're going to compete globally. We need to continue to innovate or partner, right?
Yeah, we often talk a lot about the reason we need strong policy mechanisms at the local, state, and federal level is because of that global competition.
Right.
And if we don't, we have the potential to maybe, be the last one standing when it comes to the internal combustion engine. But that also means our market is constrained. There's not growth. And we really lose out on everything else that's taking place across the globe. And it's access to critical minerals. It's the ability to develop the innovation pathways. And then also, it's not a good thing if China ultimately is the only game in town. They unfortunately, they have a track record of product dumping. They have a track record of market manipulation. And obviously, they have a government that allows them to participate differently than we do. And so it really is the reason why we need the policy. It's not to put our sort of thumb on the scale on one particular type of technology, but much more that this is what's taking place globally. And if we don't do something, we're going to be in big trouble.
Right. No, you're right. Their ability to, like, China's just an interesting, like, just you said the government, but also their ability to pivot quickly.
Yeah.
They're able to, they went into Mexico, had pure battery electrics. They discovered that plugins did better, started putting those into the marketplace, and just the ability, I think, just of their, the agility for them to change. And like, I think that's really giving them a lead, right? Continued lead.
Yeah. I do think that it's just something whereas, whoever's on this call and it's thinking about the idea of policymakers, it's, advocates across the country, the more that we can help expand that as a reference point and recognizing that the sort of need on policy is around this sort of how do we make sure we participate in a global market. That's really what this is about. And it is about inspiring innovation, which we are capable of, but we won't if the policy mechanisms aren't there, unfortunately.
Right.
So
The other thing I think about as we go into 2026 is something that, it seems like basic, but it's so critical is the education, the consumer engagement education. There's still a lot of perceptions that, batteries are catching on fire all the time, that, they're not green. There's not affordable. I mean, there are, still affordability is an issue, but there are some that are, affordable if you look at some of the options. But I think just a whole really more aggressive consumer education campaign to really educate consumers and really talk about what that value proposition is for an EV and if it makes sense for what where you live, what your lifestyle's like.
Yeah, I have a bit of a, we're starting to talk more about the idea that EVs are affordable, better, and convenient, the ABCs of EVs. And it's just sort of making sure that that is something that's, every consumer has the ability to access. I do think it's why fleets continue to demonstrate, strong investment in EVs, because the sort of all those economic factors, all of the ease, all the benefits, they grab onto in a compounding fashion in a good way.
Right, right.
And so that shows up. So, I don't know if you had a chance, but one of the things that struck me at the end of the year is there was this JD Powers analysis, and it talked about consumer sentiment. And it is interesting. It says that, anybody who's in the car marking or car buying market, pardon me, is actually highly likely, like 59% of people are likely to consider an EV as their next car purchase. That doesn't tell me that EVs are dead. It just tells me that we have this little challenge in the market, and we have to figure out how to focus on driving more market communication. And to your point, making sure the value proposition is well understood and it's not caught up in the sort of political dynamics. But anything else that you've seen around that consumer sentiment that's showing up that's worthwhile?
Yeah, I think in our data, it's actually from like 2024, so it's a little old, but still the same thing. We had, I forget what the data point was exactly, but it was a high percentage of those people that owned a EV would consider one for their next vehicle. So I agree with that JD Power study. They're fun to drive. There's a lot of good people enjoy them, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a good thing. And I also think because of the IRA credit where people were able to lease, that got a lot of new people into EVs. And hopefully they had a good experience and they'll buy a new one. And so I think that just has a whole new demographic of people buying EVs. And I think that's another good thing to show that we'll continue to see that grow because we have more people getting familiarized with an EV. So I think, yeah, I agree with the JD Power study that there's a strong loyalty rate.
Yeah, once you go EV, you're never going back, and my household resembles that. And yeah, to your point, it was something in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% that basically said it's 94% among current EV owners are going to purchase an EV, and again, and I think that says a lot about what their experience is overall. So okay, looking at some of the other things that might jump out. Are there any things about the model types that are interesting that you all have had the opportunity to look at? Like, are there 10 or 15 models that are really grabbing the market and the EV side that are doing well, even though maybe the rest of the market might not be going as quickly as we'd hope?
Yeah, I think if you look at definitely even the general market, SUVs seem to be like very popular. And if you look at the EV model landscape, predominantly SUVs. I think when I think about 2025, definitely Model 3, Model Y did well. They continue to dominate. But the Chevy Equinox did really well. And so I think that's a vehicle that just shows that you have a vehicle that's at a good price point. It's marketed well. It's compelling to consumers. It does well. And so I think we just need more of those options. So I think the Equinox was good. It'll be interesting to see. I'm interested in, like, once again, like Toyota and Subaru, when they launch some products later in this year, how those resonate with consumers since they have a really good, strong brand. And I think Toyota, they have the BZ4X, they changed the name, they've learned from some of that experience. And so it'll be interesting to see how they launch their new EV products. But I think there's some really good products. You have the Rivian R2. That's going to be very critical for that brand. I saw it at an event a couple of months ago. Very well designed. It has all the tech in it, so I think that should do well.
Yeah, Rivian's one of our ECBC partners, and they continue to create incredibly compelling products. I think that's true for GM, and they're another one of our ECBC partners. And sometimes when people think about it, but GM includes the Cadillac brand, like they have a broad spectrum of nameplates and automakers, and then there's some new ones coming into the market. So Scout will soon be showing up, around the country, in addition to Slate, which is the sort of modular style truck, and those will be interesting to see what they do. Are there any things that you're seeing around? Is it really a propulsion system, or is it a price that's making a decision on this stuff?
I think it's price. I think people are just trying to look, and it's, what's that monthly payment? What's that going to be like? And then we continue to see over the past 5 years an increase in, maintenance, insurance. So when a consumer's looking to buy a vehicle, they're like, what's that monthly going to be? Because I have to pay for all this other stuff, insurance, and that just, increases the overall cost. So I think that's definitely a driver. And if we look at other parts, like definitely China, but I think even other parts of the world where you can buy an EV close to price parity in ICE, it's going to sell as long as,
Yeah.
it's a good consumer experience in the selling process. There's, the dealer or whoever's selling it to them is able to explain that vehicle, talk about charging. I think all those are important, but I definitely think the price point is a critical factor in determining what you're going to buy.
The dealership experience certainly matters a lot, and there's some dealerships that are great, and then I think there's some that are still in the, they're learning how to talk about EVs. And I do think it's an interesting dynamic, and it's maybe not true for the rest of the world, right? The dealership sort of franchise model that we're so used to in the US is not actually how most of the rest of the world purchases vehicles, and it does really change consumer experience
Yeah,
overall.
it does. Yeah. And the other thing related to price, average transaction price, we did see in December, we haven't, the numbers haven't been finalized, but it looked like incentives are going to be roughly around 16-17% of average transaction price. So I think we'll continue to see manufacturers put incentives to help move the EVs. So that should help with along with some of those states that have incentives. So I think those are some of the other financial areas that can continue to help move EV adoption in 2026.
So a couple themes we've brought up: policy matters, and it's showing up. There's still an opportunity to look at local, state, and then hopefully some point federal. It's been hard to do right now. The other thing is this need to sort of engage consumers and maybe helping better understand the value proposition or the ABCs. And then there's sort of the forecasting. And so like, what does it look like, not just in
Yep.
26, but beyond? One of the questions that came up from the chat is, how much does your forecasting take into account what automakers are saying? And, good example is Rivian or Scout or some of these others who have booked orders, right? Because they have deposits. And so how much do you take that into account when you think about what the future looks like?
Yeah, we take that into account, looking at what their production, like what they're going to do, their shifts in production, that definitely goes into the forecast. And that's why looking at hybrids, that forecast is going to, you look at this year, I think at Q3, it was like 13% share of all vehicles sold. That's going to get increased. I think it's probably close to 17, 18 in 2026, because we've seen manufacturers starting to shift more towards that. So definitely that's something that influences the forecast.
Yeah. How much do you all take into consideration the sort of public sentiment? Like I mentioned the JD Powers report, but how much of that is a part of what you do in your forecasting as well and looking at the future?
Um, would in a sense, if you look at consumer sentiment, like we follow, you look at the University of Michigan consumer sentiment, we partner with Morning Consult to look at what consumer confidence is and look at that to kind of gauge some of that as well.
Got it.
Yeah, because there's a lot of definitely it's interesting too if you look at consumer sentiment, and it's interesting because usually when gas prices go down, consumer sentiment goes up. But I think there's so many other things going on right now in the country that even though gas prices are extremely down, we're still seeing consumer sentiment not where it has been in the past.
Yeah.
So that's the other
Um,
thing going into 2026 in terms of like the overall volume not increasing for overall market as well because of consumer sentiment and other
yeah, and it's hard
tailwinds,
to make a judgment
headwinds.
around the political dynamics, right? It became a bit of a political issue, a wedge issue in the
Right,
elections.
right.
Um, and it sort of made it something where you're either on one side or the other, unfortunately. And I think what we're always working to do at the EC is to make sure EVs are about, they're for both sides of the aisle, and the reasons to pursue aggressive policy action is something that should really resonate with everyone. It's not just people who care about the environment, but it's people who care about our economic future, the jobs in the U.S.,
Right,
et
right.
cetera, et cetera. So,
No, I think that, yeah, definitely. I think it's, and that's why it's important to have, I think, going back to the product, compelling product at the right price for whatever a consumer may want in their lifestyle.
yeah, lifestyle is an interesting question. right? Like, how do you sort of understand what that lifestyle choices are? And I think there's a perception versus reality question too. And I always think about it, in my own experience, uh, you think you need much more access to public charging than you do. That
Right,
doesn't mean we shouldn't build charging. We should.
right,
But once you're an owner and you're driving it on a daily basis, and not everyone, there's going to be unique cases, but the sort of needs change once you're actually owning it. And that's an interesting dynamic, and it's hard to do. It's almost like why I think we really focused early market on, crudely speaking, butts and seats.
right,
Uh,
right, right,
you needed that experience.
right, right.
So,
One thing I'm thinking about too, just on the whole pricing, the average transaction price. The other thing is we continue to see more technology, safety requirements, technology put, I mean, that just adds to the price of a vehicle. The other thing going into 2026 is that, we didn't really see tariff impact on vehicle prices. So with new models coming out, change in model, we'll probably start to see more of that in 2026. So another reason that that affordability issue is going to remain really constant throughout 2026.
so there's a few. I want to try to get to a few of the questions that have come in through the chat, and we'll do our best. We won't be able to get to everything, and we really appreciate everyone being active. And some of these we might be able to follow up on. One note: if people are looking for all of the background, that this great data that Stephanie's sharing, we'll put in the chat how to find the report. But when is the next report coming out for you all?
We do a quarterly update, but we're
Yep.
actually, next week, we're gonna, release our Q4 EV report for the whole year. So you'll see the full year, the actual data that came out. And then March will be our forecast call.
So we'll, at the EC, we'll make sure we share that on our social media stuff so that people can find it. But I assume people can find that on the Cox website if they're looking for that, and they want to see where all the data is. So in terms of maybe a couple of the questions that are coming up, one that came up is that just, what are you seeing in the used market in terms of price, sales, and you talked a little bit about it, but maybe coming back to that consumer preference for model, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think in the used market, close to, the volume's still small, but it's about 2%, 2.2% if you look at the end of 2025 share of the market, close to 400,000 units sold. But definitely if you look at certain times in the year, there were months, a couple of months where the price of a used EV was within $700 of an ICE vehicle, gas vehicle. So there's more price parity. And I think the base supply is pretty consistent with gas versus EV. And I think going into the next few years, there's going to be a lot of used EV options going into the marketplace at different price points, so making that more accessible to consumers. And I think one of the things in the used market, though, that we really need to, and this goes back to the whole education, is talking about battery health, making sure consumers know there's a battery warranty from 8 to 10 to 100,000 miles. And, we have, as I mentioned, a wholesale auction called Manheim, and we have a lot of used EVs that go through that marketplace, and we're doing battery health tests. And the batteries are doing really well. So I think they're doing well, and they're only going to get better with technology advancement.
Do you have anything with what does really well mean? Like just to give, so people could use that out in the
Yeah,
world.
I think like over 90% of capacity, remaining capacity. So it starts at 100, it's still above 90%.
And this is by when?
Like within a few years, 0 to 5
Okay.
years that we're
Yeah.
testing for the majority of them.
And I've seen some data where it's like even at the 10-year mark, and I own a vehicle that was made in 2015, and we have that sort of first initial drop, but since then, very little.
Right.
And so the battery performance is, significantly exceeding expectations. I think that's not surprising. Most automakers probably were way under promising and over delivering in this case because it was a big part of
Right.
this market shift.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah. But
um,
yeah, I think the used market will be really important market for next year, 2026 and beyond.
when we looked at the, one point almost 3 million that were sold in 25, is there anything about the lease versus outright purchase that shows up? And does that say anything about what to expect in 26 or beyond?
I think the IRA commercial lease credit, that definitely increase the lease penetration. I think I don't have the data the full year, but it was around 50%, like going into like the last part of this quarter or 2025. And so, that was kind of every month having that over close to 50% of vehicles leased. I think going in 2026, that'll change. It's going to decrease. We're not going to have as high percentage of leasing. So that's going to, I think we'll definitely see that. We don't have the data yet for that, but I think that's what I'm anticipating. We'll see a drop.
Conversely, the idea of all these vehicles coming off lease, if they're a 2-year lease, it does mean this significant growth in used vehicles available.
Right.
And that, we talked about at the beginning, it's like 16 million. I think the average is somewhere between 12 and 17 million vehicles are sold annually. And then used market is somewhere around 42 million to 50 million. So the used market is actually the biggest part of where vehicle sales happen.
Right.
And there hasn't been product available. And I would say, the earliest EVs, a lot of those were much shorter range than what we've seen over the last 5 to 6, 8 years, that are all in that sort of 150 and above range, or currently where they're much more in that 250 to 350 kind of dynamic. So
yeah, and it goes back to kind of what you were saying earlier about knowing kind of your lifestyle. Do you really need 500 miles of range on a charge? Like what fits in your lifestyle? I think the one area that will continue to see advancement, but definitely needed, is the charging time, the dwell time. How long does it take to charge? Because I think that's something that, consumer likes to have the same experience as having a gas card. Go to a gas station, you fill up, it doesn't take that long, it's easy to pay, there's one every corner.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I think we need to get from a user experience.
If you don't own an EV, one of the things that I've driven my car to Indiana from North Carolina multiple times. I drove to Moab in Utah, and we've driven both Teslas and we've driven non-Tesla vehicles. I own an Ioniq by example right now. And it's until you own one, you don't know, like the computer and all the things on the car actually make it a pretty seamless experience. It doesn't mean there aren't longer dwell times and some other things, but it's not these aren't your grandfather's EVs kind of, making a joke, but it's like the technology's really made significant leaps and jumps around what it's capable of. Well, we're only scheduled for a couple more minutes, and so maybe we'll figure out how we can address some of the additional questions that are in the chat. Examples being how do we expand the adoption of or how do we expand DC fast chargers or level 3 chargers. That's not a big part of what your analysis is, but we do that work. There's ways to engage both from a utility engagement and investments there. There are still actually states where NEVI is still a part of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that those are still happening. And so states still have money to spend and are going to be expanding it out. And then the other part is with the standards, where the NAC standard is now the new standard for charging. That also helps because it makes it so that anyone who buys an EV doesn't have to think through what chargers can I use. They basically will all be accessible. But as we sort of wrap up, is there any kind of highlight that you'd want to share with people listening around your consumer insights or around your Q4 analysis and or the year-to-date analysis overall for 2025 on what that means for the future?
Yeah, I think it just shows that, this is new technology. There are many layers to it. With the policies that change, we knew this was going to happen. There was going to be a slowdown. There's a shift. It's not a elimination. It's a slowdown. We're still moving in that direction. I think the manufacturers are still committed. And I think because, the economics will eventually make sense. We have global competition. I think those are going to continue, and I think we'll continue to see manufacturers collaborate and innovate around this space. So I'm optimistic. It's going to be, definitely like last year, challenging, but we'll continue to move forward.
And this is the hard part. It is from an honesty perspective, the market is more challenging than it was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like that's what the headlines focus on. And oftentimes the headlines focus on, a 50% drop. But context matters. and 50% might not be as dramatic as what people think, even though that is a big drop
Right.
year over year. And so, I think when I come back to it, it's the idea of looking at 24 to 2025. We are at 20,000 less EVs sold in 2025 versus 2024. And that's even taking into account the tumultuous political dynamics, the tax credit coming to an end, the confusion in the marketplace. There's just lots of factors that are affecting that outcome. And so I am like you, I remain optimistic. However, I do think we need to, keep our foot on the accelerator on policy because it is about that global competition and ensuring that the U.S. isn't just holding on to outdated, antiquated technology like the internal combustion engine, and that we're a part of innovation in this future, which is most assuredly electric. So, Stephanie, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I will add a couple things. People can find the current report on the Cox website. We will also post some of this in the chat. You all have a EV report that's coming out next week.
Correct.
And it'll be specific to what happened in 2025. And so people should be on the lookout for that, although we'll also share it. There's a ton of information that people can find throughout the Cox brands that includes Kelley Blue Book, lots of others. And so just good ways to find information. And we're really lucky to have you as a partner. And then we need to do our best to focus on driving policy forward, making EVs more affordable, better, and convenient. But it's a bump in the road. Electrification is still here to stay. And I'm glad that we get to work with people like you, Stephanie, to understand what's taking place. So thanks so
No,
much.
thank you so much.